Today we will touch upon a topic that concerns everyone. What is weakness, and why can it become an obstacle on the path to our goals? We are accustomed to thinking of weakness as merely a lack of strength, something neutral, and sometimes even associated with kindness. But what if weakness is something more, something that deprives us of confidence, prevents us from being honest with ourselves and others, and ultimately leads to unhappiness? The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche considered weakness a serious threat. For him, it was not just a lack of physical or moral strength, but an inability to be candid, to accept the truth about oneself and the world. His ideas compel us to view strength and weakness from an entirely new perspective, to reconsider our actions and relationships. Why is weakness associated with unhappiness? How does true kindness arise from strength? And what role does honesty play in all of this? In this video, we will explore Nietzsche's key ideas, which remain relevant today, and try to understand how to overcome weakness to live a full, meaningful life. This is just the beginning of a larger conversation. So subscribe, give a like, and let's dive into philosophy together. The starting point will be Nietzsche's fundamental notion that weakness, at its core, is a form of dishonesty. As an illustration, we can turn to an example from a literary work steeped in melancholic sentiment. In one of Fyodor Dostoevsky's stories, the protagonist falls hopelessly in love with a young girl named Nastenka. They spend several nights conversing about life, and Nastenka shares her experiences, believing herself to be in love with another man who, in her view, has abandoned her. Over time, Nastenka seems to develop a strong attachment to the protagonist, to the point of considering staying with him. However, at the decisive moment, her former love reappears, and she runs to him, leaving the protagonist alone and devastated. What is remarkable in this situation is how the protagonist tries to convince himself that he has come to terms with what happened. He tells himself that at the very least, Nastenka is now happy. However, deep within the human soul, unfulfilled aspirations and emotional pain often linger. This situation vividly demonstrates the concept of weakness and the accompanying dishonesty that Nietzsche contemplated. It is not about a lack of physical strength or self-confidence, but an inability to openly acknowledge one's own feelings, even when it causes suffering. This Nietzschean perspective on weakness and dishonesty permeates many of his works, particularly Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. For the philosopher, true weakness lies in the inability to act in accordance with one's own will, in allowing circumstances and unfulfilled dreams to govern one's life. This raises a natural question. How often do people pretend everything is fine when in reality they feel the need to shout their true feelings to the world? And, most importantly, how can one overcome this paralyzing weakness and learn to be honest, strong, and true to oneself? It is important to note that Nietzsche examines weakness from various perspectives depending on the context. One of the most common cases is the weakness of a person who has a goal but, for some reason, cannot achieve it. An example is the figure of Napoleon, who, despite his power and determination, was unable to create the great empire he dreamed of. Nietzsche does not consider the inability to achieve a goal problematic in itself. What concerns him is when this leads to dishonesty with oneself. As a vivid illustration of such self-deception, we can return to the protagonist of Dostoevsky's White Nights. At the end of the story, he vainly tries to convince himself of a favorable outcome, even though reality suggests otherwise. Friedrich Nietzsche viewed such behavior as a manifestation of deeply rooted weakness, which he particularly despised. Instead of boldly facing reality, acknowledging the collapse of his hopes, and finding the strength to endure it, the protagonist chooses the path of self-deception, retreating into a world of illusions that prevents him from accepting the truth. Instead of continuing to fight for Nastenka's affection or seeking opportunities for personal growth, he prefers to convince himself that he no longer feels anything for her. From Nietzsche's perspective, this is a manifestation of weakness, indicative of a person's inability to overcome themselves and subordinate their will. There is no genuine development here, only a pitiful attempt to escape painful truth. Nietzsche believed that, in extreme cases, this weakness could transform into resentment and bitterness. In his work on the genealogy of morality, he suggests that when people are unable to achieve their desires, be it power, love, independence, or recognition, they begin to devalue those very aspirations. Instead of admitting defeat, they prefer to convince themselves that they never truly wanted those things, turning what they once deemed worthy into an object of contempt. Nietzsche's philosophical inquiries extend far beyond the superficial manifestations of weakness, delving into the depths of human nature and addressing its internal flaws, the very shackles that restrain us from within. Among these internal weaknesses, he highlights an unrestrained pursuit of satisfying one's whims, devoid of any moral compass or concern for the well-being of others. Nietzsche criticizes hedonism not for its amorality, but for revealing a lack of inner discipline and organized will. However, before delving into this complex topic, it should be noted that Nietzsche's understanding of the will is multifaceted and was reinterpreted throughout his creative journey, particularly in his later posthumous works. In these later writings, the concept of weakness takes on an entirely different tone. It ceases to be synonymous with physical frailty or external powerlessness and becomes a reflection of a deeper problem: the disorganization of one's will. Nietzsche viewed the will as a unique phenomenon, a constellation of internal forces, each striving toward its own goal, competing for the right to determine a person's direction. This idea may seem abstract, but it resonates with everyday human experience. Imagine a situation where you want to drink a cup of tea, but then you remember the need to prepare lunch, and soon after an impulse arises to go to the store for something tasty. These seemingly trivial, conflicting desires ultimately lead to disorientation and a loss of clear direction. This is precisely what Nietzsche addresses when he discusses the disorganized will. When a person is unable to coordinate their desires and act purposefully, they become paralyzed, unable to take a confident step in the chosen direction. This is where the connection to the previously mentioned idea of weakness lies. The inability to make consistent decisions and adhere to them leads to the abandonment of one's desires and dreams. This lack of purpose breeds a kind of nihilism, where the absence of firm principles deprives a person of the ability to perform meaningful actions. As an illustration, consider the example of King Edward I of England. Despite possessing immense physical strength and boundless authority, he was susceptible to the influence of court favorites and was marked by inconsistency in decision-making. Ultimately, this indecision led to the loss of his throne and a tragic death. Thus, a king endowed with power but lacking control over his own will fell victim to his weakness. Another key concept in Nietzsche's philosophy is sincere devotion to something. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the final stage of the development of the Übermensch, superhuman. This stage symbolizes the ability to create and follow one's own values, directing one's actions in accordance with principles chosen independently. The superhuman defines their own path, avoiding both nihilistic inaction and the fragmentation of the will, which splinters into countless directions, getting lost in endless possibilities. Thus, Nietzsche called not only for the strengthening of the will, but also for the discovery of meaning and direction to live in accordance with one's true convictions. The idea of weakness in Nietzsche is closely tied to the concept of self-overcoming. At first glance, this may seem complex, as Nietzsche explores this term subtly, but it primarily concerns the will's ability to align itself and move in one direction. In other words, the will can impose strength upon itself, and this is what constitutes self-overcoming. Friedrich Nietzsche offers a different understanding of strength and weakness, distinct from conventional views. Strength for Nietzsche lies not only in achieving set goals, but also in the ability to overcome resistance, particularly internal barriers. It is the capacity to keep the will steadfast and purposeful, akin to an unwavering intention. This can be compared to a resolve that does not yield to doubts, an inner power that allows one to maintain focus. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han argues that trust arises precisely to compensate for a lack of control and information. We can never be certain of others' actions, so we rely on trust, hoping they will keep their promises. Being reliable in this sense means possessing strength, as people begin to believe in your words and depend on you. This, according to Nietzsche, is something we all secretly aspire to. Nietzsche also condemned the lack of organized will, as he believed it made it impossible to overcome nihilism. In his view, accomplishing great deeds that imbue human existence with meaning distinguishes us from other living beings. Nietzsche was obsessed with the idea of humanity reaching its maximum potential. He believed this was possible only if all facets of our will were directed in a single direction. One cannot live a truly meaningful life if the will is weak and uncontrollable. This is not only a practical matter, though that is important too. Without consistency, people are unlikely to trust us, which complicates achieving our goals. But there is also a deeper philosophical aspect. Nietzsche believed that without a strong and organized will, any suffering or hardship could push us toward nihilism, a contempt for life itself. In Nietzsche's philosophy, there is a fundamental idea that prompts reflection. Weakness is not as harmless as it might seem at first glance. This is undoubtedly a familiar concept, as a disorganized will undermines the trust of others, and, worse still, one's own self-confidence, which can destabilize all areas of life. In light of this, it is worth delving into one of Nietzsche's most controversial positions, namely his view on human compassion, which, in his opinion, is not always innocent. According to the philosopher, in certain situations, this feeling can be catastrophically destructive. Society from childhood encourages us to show compassion, to care for those in vulnerable positions, and compassion is often seen as the optimal way to do so. However, Nietzsche, contrary to popular belief, did not advocate cruelty or the abuse of power. He viewed such relationships as a sign of insecurity, comparable to an adult boasting about defeating a child in a tennis match. Nevertheless, the philosopher was critical of using compassion as a motivational mechanism for providing help, seeing in it a degree of deceit and the potential for unexpected negative consequences. As is often the case with Nietzsche's ideas, this opinion sparks debate, and while there is a grain of truth in it, one should not unconditionally agree with everything the philosopher said, as it is not an absolute truth. At the core of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical views on human nature lies the pursuit of power. In his opinion, an insatiable thirst for domination, whether over one's own life or the surrounding world, is the driving force shaping various behavioral patterns. This manifests in career ambitions, the relentless accumulation of wealth, practices of self-sacrifice, and even a readiness for martyrdom. Compassion, especially when it is sought, is closely intertwined with this dynamic of power, occupying a special place in Nietzschean philosophy. Nietzsche viewed compassion emanating from those lacking power as a kind of covert weapon. Instead of open confrontation, such individuals resort to compassion to evoke sympathy and receive help from others without taking on any obligations or responsibilities in return. This is fundamentally different from seeking support from a friend or entering into an equal agreement. In Nietzsche's view, individuals who beg for mercy without offering anything in return position themselves as helpless, akin to children, as if saying, "I can't do anything myself, so someone must do it for me." Nietzsche saw this as a manifestation of dishonesty, believing that nature highly values honesty in relationships. As an example, consider a situation where a person provokes the stronger, and upon receiving a rebuff, tries to evoke pity with words like, "Oh, don't hit me, I'm small and weak." This manipulative tactic is aimed at influencing others through pity, using feigned vulnerability as a shield. Nietzsche criticized pity for two main reasons. First, because of the dishonesty inherent in manipulating others without taking responsibility for one's requests. Second, because he believed that in the long term, this dynamic is not beneficial. Dependence on pity may bring temporary gains, but over time, it leads to a sense of devaluation and emptiness when a person realizes they still have not achieved what they desired. The pursuit of pity may be an attempt to alleviate a difficult situation, but deep down, the problem remains unresolved. True strength and authenticity, according to Nietzsche, lie not in relying on others to solve problems, but in facing them honestly and responsibly. Let us consider a profound concept presented by Nietzsche regarding pity and magnanimity, in which he viewed pity, especially from those with greater strength, as something concealing certain motives. An entirely different picture emerges when a person confident in their strength and capabilities offers help to others, driven by a sincere desire and overflowing with their own generosity. True compassion is fundamentally different from attempts at manipulation. Nietzsche viewed pity as a kind of trap, something that restricts and weakens another person, fostering their dependence. Even if pity comes from a position of power, it remains dishonest. According to the philosopher, nature itself rejects any form of deceit. For a clearer understanding, we can turn to the example of abuse in relationships. In such situations, the aggressor may resort to manipulations to foster dependence in their partner. This strategy may involve gradually undermining the partner's confidence and abilities until they are convinced of their inability to exist without external help. Over time, the victim begins to believe this, as they have no opportunity to prove otherwise. Friedrich Nietzsche criticized this form of control, which he likened to covert pity, seeing in it an attempt to enslave another person, depriving them of independence for personal gain. Imagine a situation where a person in such dependence seeks support, admitting they cannot cope with life's difficulties. In healthy relationships, a partner would strive to support them in finding their own strength and gradually restoring their independence. However, according to Nietzsche, a person driven by pity acts in the opposite way, as if saying, "I'm helping you, but only so that you depend on me to strengthen my power over you." This is akin to a loan with exorbitantly high interest rates, which only deepens dependence. In his work, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche argued that the philosophers of the future, true transformers of values, must reject this mentality of pity. Instead, they should encourage people to develop their own will to power, helping them strengthen their abilities rather than suppressing them. This is one of the principles that Zarathustra preached to his followers. From nature's perspective, such an attitude would be a manifestation of magnanimity, not pity. The difference between a manipulator and a partner offering genuine help may be subtle, but it is fundamental, as Nietzsche demonstrated through the contrast between pity and true support. Such toxic interactions, in his view, stem from weakness, both from those who seek pity to gain control and from those who offer it to maintain power over another. True strength, according to Nietzsche, manifests in magnanimity, in the refusal to maliciously exploit a situation. The greatest strength lies in self-confidence, independence, and self-sufficiency, which do not require validation through power over others. A person possessing such strength recognizes it and feels comfortable, even valuing the strength of others and the rivalry that arises from it. This is about a strength that manifests not in behind-the-scenes intrigues, but in a sincere desire to help. According to Nietzsche, this type of personality is closest to his ideal of the superhuman, not a ruler with an army, but a genius capable of transforming the world through talent and intellect alone. This example refutes the common misconception of Nietzsche as an apologist for despotism. The philosopher saw weakness in hypocritical pity, in feigned help aimed at control. This is one of the key aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, the rejection of a life based on weakness and the aspiration for an authentic affirmation of existence. It is worth reflecting on how to evaluate a philosophy of life. Many believe that the criterion is truth. However, Nietzsche had a different view. While not denying the idea of truth, he believed that philosophical concepts concerning the value of life and how to live it cannot be objectively evaluated. Each person is inevitably tied to their personal perspective, and their experience is limited to what they have lived through. By claiming what life truly is, people often forget that they only have access to their inner world. It is impossible to view life impartially from the outside. This is why Nietzsche distanced himself from pessimism and its associated philosophical currents. He realized that attempts to judge life as a whole, outside of personal experience, are absurd. Friedrich Nietzsche posits the impossibility of a rational or objective evaluation of human existence. Each of us faces a dilemma. Either reject life, seeing only negativity in it, or embrace it fully, acknowledging its positivity. However, both paths carry hidden dangers. The rejection of life, according to the philosopher, leads to the self-destruction of the personality, while embracing life becomes a colossal challenge requiring immense inner strength. It is in this context that Nietzsche presents his captivating concept of amor fati, which translates from Latin as love of fate. Inspired by Stoic ideas, he takes this notion to its absolute limit. The philosopher seeks to understand how a person can love life even when it appears in its darkest and most unappealing forms. For Nietzsche, this is not merely a theoretical question, but a matter of personal survival. For much of his life, he struggled with a severe chronic illness that often left him unable to move or live fully. Instead of succumbing to complaints and despair, Nietzsche used his pain as a source of inspiration for his profound reflections. Suffering took on a special meaning for him, becoming an integral part of his life's journey, something he could take pride in. Thus, he found a way not only to accept but to elevate suffering, transforming it into a triumph of the spirit. However, the philosopher recognized that such love of fate requires a particular strength, directed not at dominating others but at overcoming one's own weaknesses and limitations. Interestingly, this manifestation of power led Friedrich Nietzsche to develop deep respect for figures like Jesus Christ. Despite his critical stance toward Christian doctrine, the German thinker saw in the founder of Christianity an exemplar of remarkable self-discipline, complete absence of malice, and even a kind of love for fate. Jesus did not seek conquests, yet, in Nietzsche's view, he possessed immense inner strength. On the other hand, philosophers with weak spirits, according to Nietzsche, can pose a danger, harming not only themselves but also those around them and society as a whole. This radical Nietzschean vision, which calls for embracing and even loving the harshest aspects of existence to gain strength, continues to inspire, though following this path requires considerable courage. In his work, Twilight of the Idols, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer, Nietzsche sharply criticizes Socrates, one of the pillars of ancient philosophy, questioning his stance in the face of accusation and a death sentence, particularly his attitude toward life. In Plato's dialogue, Phaedo, Socrates asserts that a true philosopher does not fear death. For him, death is a release from bodily limitations, an escape from an unworthy existence. This view of devaluing life through reason was shared not only by Socrates. Arthur Schopenhauer also held this perspective, describing existence as an almost unbearable burden to be endured until one finds peace in non-existence. Imagine if Friedrich Nietzsche, armed with his penetrating insight, were among us today. There is no doubt that he would unleash criticism on the modern anti-natalist movement, which advocates avoiding procreation due to the inevitable suffering that awaits humans on their life's journey. Such reasoning, in the philosopher's view, is nothing more than a manifestation of spiritual weakness, a surrender to difficulties disguised as philosophical reflection. This is the direct opposite of his concept of amor fati and boundless love for fate, a deep commitment to life in all its manifestations, including the most severe trials. Instead of embracing life with an open heart with all its joys and sorrows, anti-natalist philosophies promote intellectual detachment, as if life is something to be avoided at all costs. But why is this so important? Nietzsche was convinced that such a mindset, infiltrating and spreading through society, acts like a poison, gradually undermining its values, weakening its members, and ultimately leading to decline. He saw this dangerous dynamic manifested in Christianity, particularly in the version preached by the Apostle Paul, which elevated chastity and self-denial to the pedestal of virtue. While Nietzsche admired the personality of Jesus Christ, he sharply criticized the idea of viewing earthly life merely as preparation for something greater awaiting in the afterlife. For him, such a concept devalued the present, diverting attention from pressing tasks and encouraging people to despise earthly existence in favor of an ephemeral hope for future reward. By denying our deepest, most fundamental impulses, Nietzsche argued, we disconnect from what makes us alive, strong, and vibrant. He viewed such denial as a theft of vital energy, the indomitable instinct that drives us to struggle, overcome obstacles, and live a full, vibrant life without postponing it for later. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, criticized philosophical systems created in his view by people of weak character, asserting that they spread this weakness to others. Just as the unhappy seek their own kind, those who feel physically or emotionally inadequate strive to draw others into their pessimistic worldview. One way this weakness spreads is through the use of moral principles as a tool for manipulation. Another method lies in instilling the idea of life's meaninglessness. If a person is convinced that life has no value, what can inspire them to find joy, seek meaning, fight for their goals, or even simply get out of bed? Nietzsche believed that such philosophies which reject life give rise to passive nihilism and a constant sense of dissatisfaction. He viewed these ideas not as legitimate philosophical doctrines, but as genuine diseases of the spirit, deserving of contempt. While not everyone shares Nietzsche's perspective, particularly his interpretation of Socrates' character, there is a rational core in his critique. In society, there exists a certain resistance to expressions of enthusiasm for life or anything that exceeds conventional norms. In some circles, optimism is met with suspicion, and a person adhering to a joyful outlook on the world risks being labeled naive or even foolish. However, this tendency is not limited to specific cultures, permeating smaller social groups as well. Often, the presence of just one cynical or pessimistic individual is enough for their influence to spread, transforming expressions of optimism into a kind of daring challenge or at the very least an object of ridicule. Friedrich Nietzsche noted this phenomenon with concern, asserting that pessimistic philosophical doctrines find fertile ground because not all people possess the spiritual strength to maintain an optimistic worldview. Thus, they drag others along, imposing their negative perception of life.